Thank you very much to both of you for your contributions. I would have a question to each of you. So, Sandra, I would like to ask you, what would be the difference between a synchronic interpretation of the Gospel of Mark and your approach to Mark as memory? So what does it add to our understanding of Mark to call it memory if we just interpret it on a, I would call it a synchronic way? And my question to Samuel would be, I have a difficulty in seeing a direct connection between the Schreier genre and the historical memory of Jesus. Because, as Catherine Hescher has shown in a long article already in 1996, the Schreier is almost completely absent from texts of Hellenistic Judaism before 70. There are some exceptions in Philo and Josephus and Achika and the Testament of Job, but that is it. And it is very widespread in Greek philosophical tradition and in Greek education, and when it appears again in rabbinic texts, especially in the Apophthegmata Patrum. So it seems to be a genre that was used in a Greek philosophical tradition with a biographical interest, but not in a Jewish context of, let's say, rural Galilee or Palestine or whatever. So for me it is rather unlikely that there is a direct link between the historical preservation and transmission of the Jesus story and the Schreier genre. It is more likely that it was introduced at a more advanced level, at a more advanced literary level into the Jesus tradition to shape the knowledge of Jesus' teaching and activity into such a genre. But then it would not be very probable that there is a direct connection between a historical memory of Jesus and this genre, Schreier.
Thank you, Jens. And it picks up the discussion we had a little bit yesterday. And I've also read her article, so I'm aware of that problem. And actually, I'm not arguing for a direct connection back to the historical memory of Jesus. And I'm certainly not arguing in favor of trying to trace some kind of pure form via the Schreier elaboration. So I think that when we are on the, let's say, Palestinian soil, Aramaic language, I would not argue that we can detect traces of Schreier there. I'm simply observing that we have this in the Gospels and trying to find ways to deconstruct the Schreier elaboration in the Gospels to see what happens and how far back we can get by doing that. And I'm perfectly aware that the Schreier could be expanded and then abbreviated again. So it's not a straight line back. It's not a new version of the old-fashioned quest for the reliability of the Gospel tradition. So I think I'm in agreement with you. Now, also, even though I'm not doing very much on the Aramaic part of this, I still think that is an open question. It's basically an argument from silence. We don't have evidence of it elsewhere, so it didn't exist in the beginning of the Gospel tradition. But that's actually another point. Basically, I'm not interested in what happened at that early stage when I speak about the Schreier elaboration, but what happened when it was, let's call it, translated into Greek, what might have happened, moving from the Gospels, deconstructing the Schreier elaborations, and see what happens. I think what is still, research in these days, we detect lots of Schreier in the Gospels, maybe too many Schreier. Remember when I talked about it the first time, I think it was in the beginning of this century, there was almost no one working on it. But today we detect grey everywhere, and that's good. But what we don't do today yet is to try to deconstruct the elaboration and see what happens. Is that really possible to do, to deconstruct them, and in that way use that kind of form critical analysis for diachronic analysis?
The question was whether there's a difference between a synchronic reading and reading Mark as a memory text. As you said yourself yesterday, memory is not a method, it's a hermeneutics. And the hermeneutical frame of using memory allows us to see a production history or an origin history without reading it into the text. Usually synchronic readings do not comment on traditions, and our traditions have been processed in text. And reading a text from a memory point of view would allow to look at how a text deals with different traditions. And what I've tried to show is that this text is dealing with different traditions and excluding, dismissing some, and embracing some, which is typical for everyday processes in collective memory. We are constructing how we want to remember something, and this draws, of course, from social and cultural frames and from traditions that have been handed down. And here we have, I think, a very good example of how this negotiation takes place. So I'd say it's more than merely synchronic reading, because it says there has been something handed down, we can see this, but we do not really know where it comes from.
I want to address my question to Sandra as well. Thank you for your really inspiring insights in this variety of Jesus images in Mark. And I was wondering why this list on table 3 is still limited to certain well-known titles. So my question would be, maybe that an exegetical concept was read into the text regarding titles, because you did not include, for example, a lot of other interesting metaphors. Let us take Mark 2:17, physician, Mark 2:18, bridegroom, and so on. That leads me to my second question. You said, you want to get rid of all these presuppositions and deal only with the text as we have it. How could you avoid to replace the former question for the real Jesus through the question for the real text?
That's a lovely one. To be honest, I just deleted the physician from the list before I came here, because I was never sure whether to use it as a reception category for Jesus or not. It's only on Jesus' lips and it only appears once. The same in a different way holds true for the groom, which is a kind of awkward metaphor introduced by Jesus, and I'm never sure whether Jesus talks about himself or rather talks about God, who is, through the Old Testament, the groom or the spouse or the fiancé of Israel. So they should be on the list, and they have to be negotiated. Nevertheless, I have added the heretical phenomenon as one of the reception categories, which never appears as a title, but is still negotiated. And as regards the question, replace the real Jesus by the real text, well, that's a difficult one. We only have some materialization of text, but I'm fully aware that there is not that text, but a variety of different texts. But this is as good as we can get. Of course, there is no security about the text as is, but about versions that are at hand. Does it answer your question?
Not really. I'm not asking about manuscript, but about the text, which is only produced in the interaction between a reader within the whole reception history. That is not the real text, but it's only a produced text in time of reading.
Would it help if I corrected it to the literal manifestation?
Your own literal manifestation.
No, the literal manifestation as on the page.
Does not exist.
Sorry?
This does not exist without a reader, without someone drawing on it.
I wouldn't agree. I think the theory of Echo holds that, saying there is a literal manifestation, and to get from that to perceive text, something has to be done. But whatever is printed on this page does not just disappear when I leave the room, it's still there. It might not be received as text, I agree with that, but there is still something there.
Thank you. I have a question for Samuel, so I'm standing up so I can see you. First of all, we are narrativizing creatures. You know, we're hardwired to turn everything into story and narrative. And if we remember an event, we're already in the process of encoding that event in our memory. We're already narrativizing it. It's already taking narrative form. That's the first point. Second point is that ordinary, uneducated people tell stories, especially in oral culture like first century, most of first century society. Ordinary people were skilled storytellers. They didn't just talk in a formless way. They told good stories. They had, they had particular narrative forms in their consciousness. So we must not think of story. We must not think of of forms of stories as something that only got out of education. They must have been around in popular storytelling. And by popular, I mean, not just professional storytellers, but just everybody's constantly telling anecdotes of what happened to them yesterday and so on. We all do that, and we all put them in narrative forms. Now, I'm inclined to think that the Kreia is simply a widespread popular form of telling a story which the rhetoricians have formalized and which they then teach people to use. As you illuminate, it's very, very helpful, various ways in which people will talk to vary a Kreia and so on. But it's a kind of formalization in the rhetorical schools of what was going on anyway in the ordinary culture.
I think I would say yes, yes, yes to all your 3 points, and especially the last point. I don't see any kind of, on the contrary, rhetoric in general. I regard it as a, as you said, a formalization of speech that has worked well in persuading people, being persuasive. Now, the addition which I see in the progymnasmata, and it has to be added that the progymnasmata are elementary teaching, so it's not advanced teaching, is that they do train how to make these small anecdotes even more persuasive. So there is a deliberate use of forms and elaboration that I think we can detect in Mark and Luke as well, to some extent. Yes, and with the addition that if we should speak of forms and do form critical analysis, I think it's helpful to find forms that we know that people had learned to use. I mean, the old form criticism, they invented their own forms. And we don't even know if people ever trained with these forms. We talked about Birger Gerhardsson yesterday. He was very much fond of Moshalim, aphoristic Moshalim and narrative Moshalim. And when we discussed it, the criticism that I gave him was precisely this, that they never trained with these kind of forms, but with the Kreia and other forms, they trained to do it even more persuasive. So that's why I think there's a potential there to use.
Yes, I mean, we obviously agree. There was a tendency in the form critics course to think that before the stuff was put into these forms, it was just some sort of amorphous, there was no form to it. And I think what we've learned is that forms go back as far as you can possibly go in memory. So the formalisation of the form, shall we say, when Mark writes his Gospel, is a formalisation of a form of a story that could well go back as far as you can go.
Then maybe we have some different emphasis. When I would also imagine that when the stories that were told in Aramaic, for instance, moved into the Greek, the process of formalizing them started. So it started already on a pre-Markan level, if you want to say so,
yes,
in the Jesus tradition itself, and it was not only Mark's invention to do that kind of elaboration.
I wasn't meaning to define the point. I said, suppose it was Mark, but I mean, I'm not being dogmatic about it being Mark rather than before Mark.
Richard, could you just pass it behind you?
Yeah, I think both papers were very, very interesting and thought-provoking for me personally. Sandra, for you, I would like to ask concerning Mark's Christology, on the notion of putting your exegetical spectacles to a side. In this memory tradition, there's an emphasis also that Mark would be in a dialectic with already existing tradition. It's not in a vacuum, of course. Mark is not seen as an originator of tradition, but as communicating also with that existing tradition. How do you think that should affect our exegetical eyewear, that notion, that knowledge?
And processing. I think the important thing is to be aware that the text didn't come out of the blue. There was something before, and as I said earlier, I think what is important is to realize that this happens in a social setting, and that it interacts with what is around. I wouldn't say that Mark is not creative or inventive. I simply cannot say what might be his inventions or what might not be his inventions, because we have so little pre-Markan stuff. I wonder every so often whether Mark has just invented the empty tomb as a literary device to get across the message, go away from that grave. He obviously had tradition handed down from Paul that Jesus was risen from the dead and all the rest of it, but he had it in, so to say, semantic memory and had to turn this into episodic and needed some literary devices to do that, or needed to bridge it into an understanding. So I'd say it happens in social frames, and we cannot neatly distinguish with what was already there, what is newly invented, how did these things change. Maybe my claim is most of all, in opposition to how I phrased it, a certain humbleness, and to accept how little we know. I'm always amazed what all these scholars know, and I wonder, where do you know that from? Do you have appearances of whatsoever just to tell you? I see very little, and I'm always open to criticism if someone says you're reading something into the text.
Thank you.
Thank you for your paper, Sandras Question for Sandra. I thought it was very helpful, your reminder to back away from assuming things that aren't in the text, to keep the text central. I thought that was very inspiring, particularly when thinking about the identity of Jesus. So my question concerns, though, where you did that with regards to the identity of Jesus vis-a-vis God. And you backed away from Trinitarian categories. Obviously, we're all in agreement that there's an anachronism there when we're talking about the use of certain terms. But I think it's a mistake to back away from questions regarding the divine identity of Jesus Christ in the name of rejecting Trinitarian categories. I think of Paul's letters, which construct a divine Christology, very clearly as far as I'm concerned. and this is the kind of Christological reflection on who Jesus is in relation to God that was widespread in the early Christian communities before Mark's Gospel came into existence. So my question is, cannot we think about Jesus Christ vis-a-vis God more concretely, particularly as it relates to the title Kyrios, and I'm thinking here of the work of Kevin Rowe, Richard Hayes and others, rather than backing away from it all in the name of rightly rejecting the anachronisms of Trinitarian language, even if Trinitarian categories may not be anachronistic.
Is this a question, just to get it clear, about Jesus' self-perception or about Jesus' perception by others later?
This is about the way Mark presents Jesus.
Well, Mark avoids the title Kyrios, more or less. He has it on 2 or 3 occasions. It is pagan characters or Gentile characters that use it, or Jesus using it for himself to convey a certain idea. Well, I made strongly sort of adoptionist sequence in the beginning, and I'd say there is a struggle. It still isn't sorted out. Reading backwards, all seems clear, but I'm not so sure that it was really clear back then. And how Jesus relates or does not relate to God is a difficult issue. Elizabeth Strauss-Marborn has nicely worked it out that Mark and Jesus and the Mark narrator had different opinions. Jesus himself presents, him or sees himself more as the Son of Man, while of course Mark presents him as the Son of God. This is the only thing I can say on the layer of the what I perceive as to be the text. And I would say this is still under negotiation, although there is a tendency to lean towards the Son of God concept and see a divine nature of Jesus. But I think Mark betrays that this has not always been the case and is still heavily discussed.
Okay, very, very quickly, Anthony, last question.
I really found you really compellingly put forward almost a Jesus in Mark who's hidden. Like he's opaque, he's ineloquent, he's actually not quite comfortable in public a lot. He needs a while to process what has happened to him. He's got a really pithy message, but not much else. And it's almost like as if Jesus is, as a character in the narrative, is someone that's whose personality is almost hidden more often than not. Is that? Am I reading that? Am I hearing you correctly on that?
I'd say he's trying to hide.
He's trying to hide.
Well, I wouldn't. Maybe you could replace the messianic secret with, so to say, the Jesus secret. My impression is that he's a healer and a public person against will. This is just too much for him, but on the other hand, maybe I'm biased with my own perception of the world, that conferences like this tend to be way too much for me, and I also want to withdraw and be in silence. I might as well be being biased by my own perception of what the world is like and embrace that, because I think I see it in Mark and therefore love the Gospel of Mark very well. But nevertheless, he withdraws and he says, folks, I have a message. It's a very simple message, and please embrace it.
I'm with you on that. Is this something that you've developed, or is this something that you've seen that Jesus as someone who wants to hide somewhere else? Or are you grabbing this from the Messianic Secret, or where is this coming from?
I'm very skeptical about the Messianic Secret. I think it's an invention of the 20th century. There's always what we have read, the déjà vu in the background. I haven't found it in the literature. It just comes from interacting with the text.
Okay. I would just say that about 15 years ago, John Barton wrote a book called The Spirituality of the Gospels, and he talks about God as a narrative, as a character in Mark's narrative. So God actually is a character in the Gospel of Mark. But what Barton says is that the primary characteristic of God is that he's hidden. He's just most often silent. He's a character that is almost entirely hidden from view. And so I'm just curious, is that something that Jesus and God have in common?
Well, they have that in common with many other characters.
I guess you're right.
the one thing that I found striking about performance criticism, that it opened my eyes to the fact that the women are around all the time. And you just don't see them until the last scene when, or one of the last scenes when it said, they have been with him since Galilee.
Yeah.
So they're also hidden characters.
Sure. Well, thank you.